Welcome to the Key Chapters podcast on Revelation chapter 20. Pretty much everyone would love to live in a world without sickness, without injustice, without pain. We'd probably all love to live in a world where the government was just, the people were faithful, where there would be peace and joy and harmony among all mankind. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world right now, but one day we will. And today in our study of Revelation chapter 20, we're going to discuss all of these aspects of the future millennial kingdom. So welcome to the Key Chapters Daily Podcast. My name is Russ Brewer, pastor of Wellington Community Church in Northern Colorado. We're going through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, one key chapter per day. We're seeing God's unfolding message to the world. Today we're looking at Revelation chapter 20. Now for the last couple of days, we've been looking at the book of Revelation. Yesterday we read about the marriage supper of the Lamb and the final battle where the beast and the prophet are thrown to the lake of fire. Tomorrow we're going to be reading about the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation 21. Today we're reading about the millennial kingdom in Revelation chapter 20. Now this chapter shows us where the history of mankind's been headed ever since Genesis 3. Remember, back in Genesis 2, God's original intent was that Adam would rule the earth. And yet Adam's sin disqualified himself and his whole lineage. But today we're reading about this new kingdom that will be ruled by Jesus and a nation of his people who have been given resurrected bodies made in his image. Now that's the millennial kingdom, but before we get to the kingdom, we do have a couple matters of housekeeping in these opening verses we have to address. I should also point out that this chapter has so much to cover, I won't be reading most of these verses. I'll be reading plenty of verses, just not from Revelation 20. Hopefully you've got a Bible handy, we can just follow along together. So with that, let's get going. Verse 1 opens with the key words, "Then I saw." Now that's not a small point, because that phrase, "then I saw," it's John's way of walking us through the events of the book of Revelation, and that's important because some people were going to try to rearrange these chapters into a different order, and yet the point that John is showing us here with these little phrases like, "then I saw," he is showing us that the events of chapter 19 precede those of chapter 20, and chapter 21 follows those events of here, and so there's a sequence that John wants us to see and know and understand. So now going back to verse 1 tells us that after the events of chapter 19, now an angel comes out of heaven and takes hold of the dragon and throws him into the abyss for 1,000 years. And so at the end of chapter 19, Jesus has returned wearing a sash, declaring him to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He vanquishes his enemies, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, and that leaves just one more leader of rebellion to deal with, and that's person Satan. And so here in chapter 20, the dragon, which verse 2 says is the serpent of old, which means Satan, this dragon is thrown into the abyss. Now the abyss here is not the lake of fire. This is the place spoken of in 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 as the holding place for demonic spirits as they await judgment. And so here in verses 1 and 2, Satan is bound, and verse 3 says he will not deceive the nations any longer. And this kicks off what is called the millennial kingdom. But we need to point out a few things. Even though Satan is bound, the curse is not fully done away with. People will still have a sin nature, but now finally, they'll be able to follow the Lord's precepts without the deceptive interference of Satan. And during this time, all the world will be able to follow God's ways rather than the ways of man. Everyone will see the wisdom of God, and they will celebrate his rules and his ordinances, and we will worship him in truth, and his people will obey him. And so it's going to be the millennial kingdom, the place where Jesus reigns. Now, this is given to us here in verses 4 to 11 in some kind of cursory details. And here's the thing. These verses are just a summary of what the Bible's been saying all along. Remember we said a couple days ago that to be a good student of the book of Revelation, we really need to be a good student of the entire Bible. And so I think that John is just assuming that we know the Bible and we know what it's been saying all along, and so he's just pulling these pieces together here. And so just to kind of jog our memories a little bit, going back to Genesis 12, God had called Abraham to establish a new nation of people who would believe God and follow him. And then throughout our study of the Old Testament, we saw that the Jews were expecting the Messiah to arrive and establish a literal kingdom of God's people who will follow his way. Well, here's that kingdom. This is the kingdom that Daniel foresaw in Daniel 2:35 when he said, "The stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Or in Daniel 2:44, it describes this kingdom saying, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever." Daniel 7:14 describes this kingdom saying, "And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed." Daniel 7:27 says, Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole earth will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. This is the kingdom that Isaiah 11 looked to when the Messiah would recover his people from the nations. Isaiah 11:11. They will dwell upon the land promised to Abraham in Genesis 13:14-15. This is the kingdom where the nations will worship the Lord in Zechariah 14:16. This is where the Messiah will judge with righteous judgment, Isaiah 11:3 and 11:4. This is the place where the wolf will dwell with the lamb in Isaiah 11:6, and the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra in Isaiah 11:7. Sickness will be gone, Isaiah 33:24, and the duration of life will once again be made long, Isaiah 65:20. And so when we think about all of these passages and the hope and the expectation that the Jewish people had for this kingdom, it's perfectly clear that Jesus, who was declared to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords back in chapter 19, verse 16, has now received the throne of David as prophesied to King David in 2 Samuel 7, as well as to Mary, Jesus' earthly mother, in Luke 1:32. And so what we have here in Revelation 20 is a summary of all that we've been reading throughout the scriptures. Now let's go on. Verse 4 then shows us the kingdom reign of the saints during this millennium. Verse 5 says that these people are those who enter the millennium via the first resurrection. Now, you'll remember from Daniel chapter 12 that there is a resurrection of the righteous and a resurrection of the wicked. Here we're seeing that when the righteous saints are resurrected, they will reign with Christ. We also see this in Daniel 7:27, Matthew 19:28, 1 Corinthians 6:2, 2 Timothy 2:12, and Revelation 2:26. Those all tell us that the saints will be part of ruling in Christ's kingdom. Verse 4 is specifically referring to the people who are faithful to the Lord all the way to the point of death and tribulation because they refuse to take the mark of the beast. Now, what's the mark of the beast? There's a ton of speculation. I'm sure you've heard about some people's ideas about what it is. It's dealt with in more detail in Revelation 13:16. We don't really know what it is, except that it seems at least somehow to be related to a number. And so I would just say as a general watchword, if some institution ever threatens to kill us if we don't allow them to put a number on our forehead or on our hand, well, that's not a good sign, and it's probably just better to die rather than allow them to do that. And so going back to this passage here, for 1,000 years, Jesus and his people will reign upon earth in fulfillment of all of these Old Testament prophecies that we've been seeing countless times over the past year. And going on to verses 7 to 10. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan is released from prison and gathers the nations under the lead of Gog and Magog, and they fight against the Lord. Now, you might remember from our July podcast on Ezekiel 38, I tend to think that the real battle between Gog and Magog that was prophesied in Ezekiel 38 is actually back in chapter 19 of Revelation. But here, this battle is 1,000 years later, and it will include the same nations and the same heart of rebellion, and ultimately the same outcome. The Lord's going to be victorious. Now, this may lead us to ask, why is Satan being released at all, and why is there yet another battle of mankind against the Lord? Well, the passage doesn't exactly say, but I think we could put two and two together here. When we think about one of the reasons that God even allows Satan to exist, Satan's influence is like an X-ray that shows who truly wants to be followers of God versus those who just want to follow the ways of the world. And when we give in to Satan's ways or the world's ways, we're showing we'd rather follow them than the Lord. And so Satan's temptations and our responses make our allegiances very clear. Now, we haven't talked about this in today's study, but back in Matthew 25, the Lord tells us that before the millennium is established, there's going to be a judgment that we call the sheep and the goat judgment. And so when Christ returns, he will hold this sheep and goat judgment to decide from the world who will be allowed into his millennial kingdom. People in tribulation will have shown by their actions whether they wanted to align with God or the world. And so when it comes to the millennial kingdom here, everyone who enters into it will be there because of their desire to follow God. However, the millennium is not heaven or a state of sinless perfection. These people from the sheep and goat judgment will still be coming into this world in their natural bodies. They'll still be able to give birth in the millennium. They can even still sin in the millennium and even die in the millennium. And so after 1,000 years, you've got these folks or their children or their grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren, all living in this kingdom. And so then this final battle demonstrates who truly wants to be with the Lord and abide in his holy presence, and ultimately that his judgment on them, if they don't want that, it's just. And so there's this final battle here, and the Lord wins in verses 9, and in verse 10, once again this battle is over, and Satan is thrown into the lake of fire as well, and he's finally done. Mankind is finally rid of him. Then we come to verse 11. Verse 11 tells us about what is called the Great White Throne Judgment. This judgment now comes at the end of time. Verse 11 says, heaven and earth has fled away. And this is what Peter is referring to in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, which says that this final act of the day of the Lord will destroy the heavens and earth with a roar of intense heat and basically some kind of nuclear fission, fusion, kind of just annihilation, obliteration of everything. And in a moment, it's all gone. And then in verse 12, all of the dead are now brought before the Lord. And in verse 13, it says that they were taken from the sea and death and Hades. And this is the second resurrection from Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, which is now the resurrection of the wicked. Everyone who is not born again will be at this judgment, and no one who is born again will be at it, and no one who is at this judgment will enter into heaven. They are all bound for the lake of fire that we're going to see just in a moment. And so verse 12 says that there were books and the book of life. The books here recount every single person's details of their life. This is basically what Jesus said in Luke 12:3 when he said, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. And so these people here will be shown to be sinful and rebellious by their words and by their deeds. And here we're seeing a just punishment will be pronounced upon each and every sin. And then the book of life will be checked. And in theory, anyone whose name is written in the book of life will be spared. The problem is, none of their names are going to be there. The book of life is referred to several times in the Bible. You can see it in Exodus 32:33, where the Lord says if anyone sins against him, he will blot their name out of his book. In Malachi 3:16, it says, those who fear the Lord spoke to one another, and the Lord gave attention and heard it, and a book of remembrance was written before him for those who fear the Lord and who esteem his name. Jesus said in Luke 10:20, nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are recorded in heaven. Likewise, in Philippians 4:3, Paul says that Euodia and Syntyche and Clement and the faithful servants in Philippi have their names, it says, written in the book of life. And also in Revelation 3:5, it says, he who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life. And so this book of life is a record of those who are going to be in heaven, and the way someone's name gets written in this book of life is through genuine faith, like we see with the disciples in Luke 10:20 or the Philippian church in Philippians 4:3. Their faith then is shown to be real through their perseverance, that they are the overcomers, that they press on and endure and follow the Lord. And yet in verse 15, since none of these people have their name written in the book of life, they are all thrown to the lake of fire, which is the eternal hell that we think of hell as being. And that's just an awful place, and no one wants to be there. It's not a place where like all the people can just kind of hang out and just be like a reunion. This is a place of suffering and torment and pain. No one wants to be there. Well, that's Revelation 20, and this is just really a quick run through. So much more can be said. Obviously, there's a lot of different interpretations. I didn't even have time to get into them. And so just in case I went a little bit too fast, here's a quick summary of where we are up till now, starting in Revelation 19 to 20 here. When Christ returns, he's going to gather his people together, alive and dead, together in the rapture. They will celebrate the marriage supper that we read about yesterday in Revelation 19. If the rapture happens at the beginning of the tribulation, well, then 7 more years will pass before the events of chapter 19. If the rapture happens at the end of the tribulation, well, this will lead right into Jesus' destruction, the Antichrist that we read about yesterday at the end of Revelation 19. Well, then here today in Revelation 20, Satan will be thrown to the abyss in verses 1 to 3. He'll be there for 1,000 years. The people from the tribulation who have successfully passed the sheep and goat judgment will enter into the millennial kingdom. In the millennial kingdom, there will also be those who have received their resurrected bodies, and they will be ruling over these other people. And those who have received their resurrected bodies, they're immortal. And those who have entered just via the sheep and goat judgment, well, they're not. And the millennial kingdom will last for 1,000 years. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan will be released one more time, and his temptations will show once again that people are sinful and rebellious, and Satan and everyone who rebels against the Lord will fight against him, but they'll be defeated. And then comes a great white throne judgment, where the unsaved people from the nations will stand before the Lord. But since their names are not found in the book of life, they'll be cast into hell, and all of the redeemed will be going into the New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. And that's where we're going to be picking things on up tomorrow. So thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your day, and until tomorrow, God bless.